Welcome back to another Service Management Leadership Podcast. I have a great guest for you, Roman Jouravlev. Roman is an Axelos beacon. He is the pillar in our ITIL community. And so I reached out to Roman, asked him to be on. Roman, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you, Jeffrey. And it's a huge pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
And so let's jump straight into this if we can, just because I want this to be a meaty episode because you have a lot of wisdom to share. So you are one of the people orchestrating and architecting ITIL 4. And that is, as an outsider, is pretty curious of how did this development process go in terms of getting people's feedback, having a thought, because ITIL 4 is breaking new ground in my book. I mean, it's a big step from ITIL v3. And so what was that development process like?
Well, just stop me after a couple of hours, but I will really try to make this very long story short. And you're right, yes, I've witnessed it and been part of ITIL 4 development. I joined Axelos more than 5 years ago in autumn of 2016, specifically for the project of what eventually has got a name of ITIL 4. That days we didn't know it would be ITIL 4. And usually when I speak publicly, I introduce myself as the one who's responsible for everything you don't like in ITIL 4.
Yes.
There are many things people like about it, and who is responsible for that? You have a long list of contributors at the very end of each publication. They are responsible for everything good. I'm the one to blame. And there are some things to blame me for, because one important role that I took during this development process is to make sure that every component of ITIL 4, every publication, every product we put in this portfolio is consistent with others, that there is some integrity, there is a consistent and coherent big picture. But all started, and this big picture was originally drafted, like penciled and then painted, and maybe even put in some beautiful mosaic of some hard materials by a team of so-called lead architects of the ITIL 4 Foundation. That was a wonderful team, international team. There were days of face-to-face meetings and international travel, and we benefited from all of this, having that team in London mostly. And this included people such as Stuart Rance and Barclay Ray and Lou Hannebeck and Mauricio Corona, and we had people from Japan, people from Europe, people from America, Erin Castile from Australia. So it was quite a representative team of thought leaders. And about half of the team was had been involved in version 3 development as well, 10 years before that, because we needed to maintain compatibility. We needed to ensure that people who have adopted ITIL 4 ITIL version 3 would find it comfortable to transition to ITIL 4 and will see it as a natural, organic, let's say, continuation of their journey rather than a huge leap that would require huge organizational changes. And there is a common pattern for all products, starting with Foundation. We start products that would include a certification at the end with the creation of a syllabus. So creation of learning outcomes and assessment criteria that would eventually be tested. So we first answer the question of what we want, what learning outcomes we want to achieve, what would be the knowledge to communicate. Then, based on that, we actually plan and draft a manuscript. It's usually collective work. There were books such as High Velocity IT, where there was a lot of contributors, maybe the longest list of contributors, and their small pieces were not originally aligned. And Mark Smalley, who was the lead editor for that publication, he just reached out to, let's say, Dave Snowden, and said, Dave, we need a piece on complexity and Canevin, and we are going to use it for the purpose of that book, because we included addressing complexity in the syllabus. And Dave usually would come back with something along the lines of, you asked me for 2,000 words, I didn't have time for that, so here is 8,000 words for you. And then it would be the work of the lead editor, important role for every book, in this case, Mark Smalley, to curate the content down to 2,000 words. Maybe we would use the other 6 as a supplementary content, somewhere as an appendix. It happens sometimes. Sometimes we just needed to distill the most important things. And then the lead editor would align it with similar pieces provided by other authors. And then I would align it with other books and make sure that other books are not contradicting, that we have the same glossary, that if something was introduced by a certain book in 2017, that books in 2018 and 19 are based on it, despite the fact that people who would be working in 2018 on writing the new book, let's say strategy book, didn't necessarily read everything before. So this alignment and let's say fine polishing of the concepts and models provided by the teams led by lead editors is also part of my responsibility, including also actually suggesting lead editors, reaching out to them, inviting them, and more or less herding all those cats, or few herds of the cats at the same time. The most difficult was 2018 and 19, where we were when we were putting together 4 intermediate books and 34 practices in the course of 1 year, and that was really a tough period in terms of multitasking and juggling all that resources. So the team drafts something, then we have a list of people who agreed to review. Some of them review particular pieces, some of them review the whole manuscript. We process their feedback. And then we have at Axelos, we have a wonderful editorial team who managed to somehow miraculously turn the broken English we usually write into some proper ITIL English. And they do it brilliantly. And then the fine finishing of this is used to be done by the publishing team of our that day's publisher, the TSO. We are not in partnership with them from this year on, but everything that has been published in ITIL so far has been published with the TSO. They had brilliant editorial teams as well. So this is more or less how it was done. The most complicated one was not complicated. The most challenging one probably was the foundation, because we needed to come up with all the key concepts and models, and we had a lot of whole constellation of stars in the room, and everyone was shining, and it was blinding experience in a way, but also a huge joy. I couldn't imagine before that I would be working together with such giants, in the same room, and sometimes even criticizing them. 2 last books that we published this year or last year in 2021, one on sustainability in IT, another one on the acquisition and use of cloud solutions. They were created in collaboration. So the overall process was the same, but we had important contributors at the lead editor or lead contributors status. One was created in collaboration with DEFRA, which is the UK Agency for Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs, so basically government agency for sustainability in the UK. And another one, the cloud one, was created in close collaboration with AWS and Microsoft. And there were contributors from other cloud providers, but these 2 were the major contributors. And that also required working with people who actually know the subject better than we do, and putting it at the same time in the canvas, in the context of vital picture of the universe, which was an interesting challenge again.
I bet. And so if I can press in on two three things. I was going to say two, but three. I really enjoyed hearing you talk about the syllabus, because if we're going to preach outcomes, we have to know those outcomes. I mean, if I tell Sam, you got to have outcomes, not outputs, then to use an American phrase, let's eat our own dog food or drink our own champagne. We have to make sure we use what we do there. I also, the foundations, I think I appreciate you starting there, because I think that's the hardest conceptually, how those models fit together, whether it's the 4 dimensions, how the service value chain, service value system, how all that fits together. And I'm somewhat tongue in cheek here and seeing the word improve everywhere, right? And just how all of that fits together, I think is the toughest part for most people. And lastly, I was going to say that David Cannon's been on this podcast talking about the cloud one, and David's a friend of the show. But putting that model together for the service value system, for service value chain, that must have been challenging, I assume.
It was interesting. Yeah. In terms of wording, in terms of alignment with accepted or at least formulated our terminology, we had to align it with ISO standards. We had to align it with ITIL version 3. We had to align it with other, let's say, known and adopted sources. Mm-hmm. Or if we allow some misalignment, that we needed a strong justification for that. Similarly, with practices, with the structure of the practices, with the scope, which practices are we going to include, which practices are we not going to include, the naming for them, are they practices or are they capabilities, or why they are not processes, all that terminology discussions.
Yes.
I'm happy to say that I know the why answers for all those questions, and I believe they're still valid and reasonable.
And that's awesome to hear. When I was talking about that, I just meant everybody's a critic in today's world, and everybody is so quick to criticize. And so it leads me to my second question. What were some of the decision points of this creation process? Because there's a lot of smart people in the room with great ideas, and you had some decision points like, hey, I love your material, it just doesn't fit in. I assume there were a lot of decision points. You want to walk us through some of those?
There were many. I will just give you a few examples.
Okay.
I believe it was very important, and it was a lengthy discussion, and it was interesting how we actually came up to with the final list, the principles. Mm-hmm. The principles for ITIL were originally introduced in the brilliant ITIL practitioner publication back in 2016. And there were 9 principles, and we reviewed them, and we trimmed the list down to 7, although all 9 are covered there. It's just slight rewarding that allowed us to reduce the number. And it was a principle discussion in all senses of this sentence, and it took a lot, and it was important and interesting. Another important thing that I vividly remember is the content, let's say, the elements of the service value chain. Visual representation and the key elements, we wanted to keep it simple enough and at the same time sufficient enough. And it was obvious that there used to be a gap in version 3. If you look at the design transition operation, or let's say flow or cycle, then somewhere between design and transition in the real life, there is supposed to be some development. Mm-hmm. And there was never there. And I believe that this architectural gap, in a way, led to this harmful separation of the two worlds, the world of development. Even under DevOps flags, there is still very little focus on ops, and the world of operation, which is usually associated with ITIL. And that gap actually started, being filling with our other concepts, models, and ideas. And ITIL is still struggling to take a position in providing recommendations on that part. So we needed to address this, and at the same time to not, start competing with concepts such as DevOps, because we were all about integration rather than counterposition and competing. So that was an interesting discussion as well. Another very principal and critical discussion was who is the target audience? Is it like it used to be a guidance for internal IT serving the business, or it's a guidance for commercial service providers serving some external customers out in the market, or it's both, or can it be applied to non-IT service providers? Is it in general guidance for service providers or service consumers as well? Shall we address the service consumption or only service provision? And this is where we came up with this concept of organization as the scope of ITIL, and you can apply it to organization and scope of a single unit within a bigger corporation, bigger enterprise, or you can treat the whole enterprise as organization, or even a group of companies as organization, as long as they have common goals and management system. So I believe we managed to create quite a scalable framework, which can be applied in a very small scope or in a huge scope, and it will still be relevant. And to create terminology that would be applicable to that and models that would be applicable to this variable scope was quite a challenge. This is what at the foundation level that what we had to do.
And I bet there was, oh, sorry. I was going to say, I bet there was a lot of decision points, because most of the decision points were in the, what does the foundation look like?
Yes, because this is the first title generation, let's say, with a foundation book. Version 3 and version 2 didn't have foundation books. There were compilations that were positioned as an intro or like introduction of foundation, but they were compilations of other volumes. And this one started with the foundation book, and that's also quite a different approach to actually creating the product. We first created a high-level model and then went deeper.
Yes, and on that, I want to mention one of the decision points that I'm glad you put in, because it's something I've been preaching for a long time, and that's the outside-in view. It just shows up very small in there, but I think that viewpoint of how we view IT is important. And there was a movie several years ago in the US, it's a baseball movie. I'm not a baseball person. It's a Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And I feel like that's how IT has been for so many years, without taking the stakeholder feedback and saying, we need to align our resources to our stakeholders. And that's what I felt that ITIL 4 was going.
The first principle of ITIL is very focused on value.
Yes.
And this is why I really get almost mad when I see some comparisons saying ITSM is focused on output. I don't know, XLAs are focused on outcomes. No, ITSM is not focused on outputs. It's focused on where you focus it on. And we recommend as a good practice to focus on outcomes and value for stakeholders, which, by the way, are not only customers.
Correct.
It's multiple stakeholders, including shareholders, including your own organization, employees, society around, and all that stuff. And that is there since 2019. And I'm really proud that we managed to put it there in quite a clear way for those who take their time to read.
And your stakeholders could be accounting or legal or whomever within your internal group that you have to satisfy, and you have to build your if you're doing asset management, finance and accounting have to be included. They are stakeholders, and
absolutely.
And we have to include them. And so sorry for me to get on my soapbox, but that's one of the things that I dislike about how traditional IT is. Build it, we build it, we're the smart ones, you all have to consume it. And I like the outside in viewpoint. Are you free to talk about, loaded question, Roman, are you free to talk about some of the things that were discussed, but didn't really make it into the final product? And I say it that way because it's not to embarrass anyone. It's not, but we all have decision points in our lives, and you can't include everything. So what were some of the things that maybe had value but didn't make it into the final product?
Well, it's always a curation work. It's always because we were working in a system of many constraints. One of them is that each module of each volume of content that we create here is supposed also to serve as a source of information for an official certification, for exam.
Mhm.
And there is a training market that will be using it. And there are some market-driven requirements for the duration of the training. And from the content creator perspective, I would like to make each of these books maybe 3 times thicker.
Yes.
And like for a proper 2 weeks training, but market will not accept it. So we needed to curate. This is why I used that example with complexity and Canevin. We needed to create it down to 1,000 words from 8,000 words, not because the other 6 were of low value, but because they were not meeting this duration constraint. Even with some of the content in the books being non-examinable and not covered by the syllabus, we still have to maintain this balance of the volume to quality to scope to details to everything. And some things that I would really love to see there ended up being supplementary content rather than core content. Some things were dropped because they are based on models, or they are models from third parties. ITIL is trying to adopt everything good that had been developed in the market before and is developing now. And it would be nice to have certain concepts there, but sometimes they are copyrighted, they are owned by certain bodies that may see Axelos as a competitor. And we, in this case, had to describe certain things without naming them explicitly, or without like using the copyrighted names and giving references, but not going too deep because we were not allowed to. There were not many examples like this, but there were a few occasions where this became an issue and we couldn't solve it in a reasonable time and money. There are some concepts that are not named explicitly, but used and described. Maybe I would want them to be described in more details. One is very like raising hype right now is the experience-based economy and experience level agreements. And I'm happy to see that both in the practice guide for service level management and in the direct stakeholder value book, we explicitly say that we recommend to structure service level agreements around utility, warranty, and experience if your services are facing living, breathing users. Not all IT services are actually user facing.
Right.
Sometimes they're used by other IT services. If you think of architecture or for infrastructure as a service, it's usually used by other systems, and there is no physical or human users are experiencing anything directly from them. They experience them by proxy or for other services on the top. But generally, we do describe what is experience level agreement, how we don't use the term XLA a single time, I believe, or just say something like sometimes called EXLA or just XLA without going into naming and labeling. Sometimes I'm happy we don't do that because we don't want to create new entities without a real need for them. Sometimes I would like to highlight that this is the thing that we are currently discussing. It's already there. We just don't call it, I don't know, XLA in this example. I will not go into other examples because we don't call it. And there are some things that I would probably do slightly different. For example, as I mentioned, last year we published a book on sustainability in IT. I wished we knew that much about sustainability back in 2018, 17, when we started this work, or involved people who were working on sustainability concepts and had sustainability as a golden thread through all following publications, rather than as a separate book probably, or in addition to a separate book. I think what we are going to do now is as a normal process of continual improvement of the practice guides, to consider including some sustainability recommendations specific to each practice, because we believe it's a very important lens that will be more and more used by organizations, either by legal requirements or by goodwill.
I agree. And so I want to push in on 2 things, if I may. one of them, you mentioned experience. I think experience has become a buzzword. And the only reason I think experience is so prominent now is because we as an IT industry, I'm not pushing this on ITIL, I'm saying we as an IT industry have done service level agreements poorly to get to this point where we're focused on experience. Like if we would have had the SLA, OLA underpinning contract view before, we would have understand, hey, this is value, we need to focus on it. But since we have SLAs focused on outputs, not outcomes now, we are now both focused to now turn our paradigm towards experience. Is that fair?
It is absolutely fair. I also think that like other good ideas, sometimes it is being overhyped, overused, and has a risk of actually, how to put it politely, has the risk of the opposite effect because it's being overpushed sometimes. And I believe that if we do it by comparing and, let's say, counter positioning and putting SLAs and service level management and the experience level management as opposites, we will be throwing away the baby with the water all the time. Because it's not because the idea of SLA is bad, it's because we just didn't cook it well. And I have a sticker on my laptop, and when my laptops change, I move the sticker for a few years now. It's a sticker of Gotthart's law saying that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Yes.
That's the issue. And that will be the issue with experience as well, if we forget about value that is behind that experience. We have all the risks that we had with measuring, let's say, technology or measuring service. We have all the risks when we try measuring experience without understanding the basics of measurement and without understanding the value.
100% agree. In two parts on there, I dislike the benchmarking of experience because all organizations are unique, and that's something that's common now. And I don't think you could take two hospitals in the same city and say that they are not unique where you could compare them, much less saying every organization across every industry across the world should align, just because we're all different. That's
maybe
number
an
one.
interesting data, but definitely not sufficient to make management decisions.
Right. It brings up the quote, comparison is the thief of joy. But just because, anyway, I don't want to get down that rabbit trail. But I just think that there's so much focus on experience because we messed up what service level agreements should have been. And that's the point that I would like to transition to the next point, the next question, if I may. It's hard to believe because this pandemic has thrown off all of our timescales. I would be the first one to admit, Roman, we're approaching 3 years, or we may have already passed it, since ITIL 4 was released. You've had some time to reflect. You mentioned the environmental piece, and are there any other reflections that resonate with you? Because I think those of us who want to do great work are always reflective in assessing.
It was 3 years a couple of weeks ago, in beginning of February. I mentioned sustainability piece, and it's important to note that it's not only about environment, actually.
Right.
It's about complex, our environmental, social, and financial sustainability, and generally about thinking long-term and complex rather than local and short-term. Mm-hmm. And I believe it's a fundamental change in mindset, and it's really important. And I think it was in ITIL from the beginning, but I would like to highlight it further. Generally, I'm reasonably proud with some architectural decisions, and I will mention that one of them, the practices, we published them separately from the core books, which is different from how it was before. The books were 80% collection of processes. Now they are not. And all practices are published as individual electronic documents, very plain PDF right now, maybe it will change, which allows to update them individually without a major review of the framework. And now, after 3 years, we see what we want to update there. We have some plans of updating them, and I'm happy to see that it won't ruin the exam structure, the application. I believe we designed ITIL for more agile development and improvement. The principle is progress iteratively with feedback. And that's exactly what we designed it for the most important and maybe mostly valued right now, underestimated part of the ITIL, which is, or 5 of the ITIL 4, which is the practices. Because volume-wise, it's about, so it's roughly 30-40 pages each. There are 34 documents. So the volume is equal or more than the core publications. And they are the least read now, which again, we probably should change from the certification architecture and training architecture perspective. But content-wise, I'm really proud that they are more flexible, more agile, and more improvable, and less made in concrete. Some things that upon reflection probably could be done differently. I will give another example. It's also practice related. As I mentioned, with the consumption of ITIL content, unfortunately, is largely driven by the training market.
Yes.
In the boldest form, if it's not examinable, it won't be taught. If it's not taught, people will not read it because nobody reads the books. Most of the people, most of the students, they actually get information from ITIL by proxy of their trainers and PowerPoint presentations. It's one of the reasons why PeopleCert, apart from obvious financial reasons, why PeopleCert made the decision of making a book mandatory as part of every exam. So now people at least will have the book. One of the reasons is because there is more in the book than in the training. I'm not sure whether this measure will work and force people to read them, but at least they have an opportunity. So as practices haven't been largely examined, they haven't been largely read. I believe people are missing an important bit of it.
I read them.
That's a market structure and business model discussion rather than content discussion. But I believe there is a huge room for improvement there, like a ball hole for improvement.
I've read them, and I'm probably one of those nerds that do that. But you're right. I'm on LinkedIn a lot. I consume a lot of content. Very, very little is on ITIL 4, and even smaller of the ITIL 4 is on the practices. And you mentioned one thing that triggered a thought. In ITIL V3, if you wanted the books, you could read the books cover to cover. And I did in my spare time when I had a corporate job, just to learn, right? You read again, get deeper thought. These, you're not going to have that luxury of picking up an HBIT book and it including the practices, or they're separate thoughts. And I think that's going to be one thing that's tougher for people to conceptualize, that HBIT may have practices involved, but they're not connected.
They're not practice guides. Yeah.
And so I think that'll give people heartache until they get further comfortable with it.
But I believe it's a necessary headache. I believe right. The value of this change is higher than the discomfort associated with this. And I will give you an analogy here. We introduced a concept, finally, also long overdue, a concept of value stream. Mm-hmm. And it's quite obvious that none of the practices are enough to go through the full collection of activities in any valuable interaction. If you think of, let's say, incident management, it usually starts with either monitoring and event management or service desk, depending on how proactive or reactive we are in towards our incidents. Then incident management does some activities. Then very likely it will involve some change management or change enablement, or the way you name it. Maybe some software development, maybe some release management, maybe some deployment. It is likely to end with another monitoring and event management to confirm that everything is fine, and or another service desk activities. And this flow of activities is actually built from elements from different practices. And these major activities are supported by other practices such as configuration, asset management, knowledge management, financial management, you name it, management that provides data and methods and tools for the core flow of this value stream. And when we describe and discuss it in these terms, it becomes very obvious. However, in real life, people still keep thinking within a box of one practice or process or whatever they name it. So it requires some mental shift to see all these managements, you call them practices or capabilities or processes, doesn't matter, as just building blocks for valuable workflows, value streams in this case. Similarly, each book of ITIL refers to multiple practices, and it's the same practices. It's a collection of specialized resources that we use in order to create value for stakeholders, as you quite rightly said a few minutes ago. So it should be treated as a collection of resources rather than an established function which doesn't interact with others.
And I'm with you there, because let's say a change is going to take a different path depending on what type of change it is.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think of so we talk value streams, and I think of a stream, different parts of the stream, different times of the year, it's going to take a different path. It's going to alter slightly. And that's the imagery that I always try to give people, that it's a project management people would call it a happy path. What's the best path for us going from point A to point B without waste, without having too much bureaucracy, with all that other stuff, right? It's like, how do we get from point A to point B efficiently?
Absolutely.
That's maybe I used 20 words when one would work, but it's one of those that I just think that we get bogged down with process versus value stream versus the other. And it's how do we do things efficiently and include the right people? So you mentioned there have been several big changes from ITIL v3 to ITIL 4. And you mentioned value streams in an iterative approach. What are some of the other, in your opinion, big steps from ITIL v3 to ITIL 4?
I believe it's very important. I will give you just one, the introduction of practices, not only renaming, but introduction of practices which are described as more than processes.
Right.
So basically each management in this collection of 34, well, 33 plus one enablement, plus one service desk. Okay, so most of them are managements. And these managements are not limited to just correct workflows as they used to be.
Right.
They should include all what we call them, all 4 dimensions of service management. If you want to manage your, let's say, incidents again, successfully, then you need not only to identify the flow of actions from registration to resolution, you also need to provide proper competencies and human resources to establish maybe proper teams or make the current teams work effectively. You need to automate this process with certain information technology and tools. You need to involve third parties, because I believe there is no practice that is fully performed within the organization these days. We all depend on third parties. So restructuring the managements from focusing on processes purely to focusing on complex 4 dimensions involving the workflows, the processes and value streams. I believe it's a critical and important change, because it's not only about flows of activities. It's
Right.
about developing capability that includes these activities, but not limited to them. I believe it's one of the very important foundation level changes. Another model that I'm particularly proud of, and I believe it's a beginning of another important story in the long story, is the model introduced by the wonderful team led by Christian Nissen in the DSV book, in Drive Stakeholder Value book. And this is in the book, it's called Customer Journey. I would call it just service journey.
Right.
Because in fact, it's a joint journey of the consumer organization and the provider organization. And this shows these steps of this marriage are maybe lifelong, maybe less than lifelong, from exploration to value creation and review. And this is where ITIL explicitly, first time, I believe, provided guidance for consumer organization. And this is why we use this journey to structure the recent cloud book, because the cloud book is the cloud consumer guidance rather than cloud provider guidance. So this explicit demonstration of the mutual co-creation of value rather than just provider guidance, I believe it's an important shift in positioning ITIL. And in order to create value, it's not enough to effectively provide services. It is equally important to effectively consume services and to build and manage service relationship effectively.
I agree. And the DSB piece is one that is always resonates with me because of, you mentioned the customer journey, but this kind of touches back to that experience part, right? Is that both parts own that value co-creation. And not only do they own the results, the value, but they own almost every step from engage on. They are partnering to make sure that there's value co-created. Agree? Because, you know, explore, we can, we'll go there. Yeah, we'll just explore is something we do, but everything from engage on is co-created. So let's move to a final question, and then we'll give you a chance to give parting words. But I always think, what does ITIL 5 look like? Whatever it's named, whenever it comes out, try not to prejudice you in any way. And I think, or, you know, it could just be subsequent books like the sustainability and cloud until ITIL 4. But you all have been working on this a long time. You have thoughts on what does the future look like? Any sneak peeks for us?
I think I can officially say we do not foresee ITIL 5.
Oh.
We, I mean, not in the foreseen visible area of the future that I can penetrate with my view. There is definitely a plan for there are plans for continual development of ITIL 4, which involves improvement and updates of the current publications. First of all, the practices, as the practices evolve, because things described in other books are a bit more stable. Practices are expected to be evolving faster. This is hence the architecture of ITIL 4. And also we do plan to provide more specific guidance, such as the cloud and sustainability one. So I don't expect an architectural review of this in the, let's say, next couple of years, at least, just because I'm not brave enough to look further. And I truly think that we architected ITIL 4 in a way that it will be able to develop iteratively, and when it will be renamed, or when something will be named ITIL 5 or given some other fancy name, it will be not because there will be a major architecture review, but because there will be enough of cumulative changes to present it as a new product, and it may be driven more with marketing rather than with the content review. I have this, I hope it will be like that. I hope we created it to last, but not just to last being frozen, but to last and develop.
Yep.
And so I don't foresee ITIL 5 in any reasonably close future. because ITIL 4 has the potential for development.
Yeah, the part I stepped over you there, but the part that I think is important for all of us to understand is for this to still be germane. 3 years is a lot, given all that we've lived through the last 3 years, and our rates of change are picking up. Like, there's something we all have to admit, at least to ourselves, that the rates of change, the time of having a 1-year project and the rates of change are picking up. And that's why, I mean, it's a brave new world we live in.
We also call it VUCA. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not that brave new world, but it's definitely volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So we need to be really brave in order to survive in it. Yes.
Yeah. I just meant, though, it's like those explorers, because we don't know what's coming, and there's going to be disruption and innovation that we just cannot fathom today.
But we know for sure there will be something. It won't be the same next year as it is now. So yes. And I believe this, we tried to implement it in ITIL 4 and include it in ITIL 4, but if there will be a massive change, it will be driving ITIL 4 even further from prescriptive process and procedures based things into something more are focused on navigating complexity. We really did our best to make this step for ITIL 4 from the previous versions, but there is still space to go in that direction.
And you mentioned something that I don't have time to get into. It's just going from prescriptive ITIL v3 to the less prescriptive ITIL 4. That will say for another day, Roman, because I think that's one of the things that's difficult for people to pick up, that like value streams. You can't say checklist like an IKEA box, do 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5 in that order every time. You just can't.
Only in a limited, let's say, scope of situations. Yeah.
Right.
And the ability to switch between different complexities, switch between, let's say, simple or clear and complicated and complex and even chaotic situations, and to apply the relevant heuristics there and then to switch back, is a key skill that we all have to develop.
And there are new variables popping in every day. You know what I mean? Like, it may be the same today, but you have one new variable that changes everything. And
exactly.
So everything's anew. So as we close, are there any parting words that you have to share for us?
Just the last thing I said. Let's all be ready for even increasing complexity. And I really hope that ITIL, as it is, will help organizations to address these challenges. And I really hope that ITIL will be strong enough to face these challenges as a product and effectively develop further. I'm really curious to see where it all is going.
Me too. I'm excited for it, just because I think that when you're on the edge of new, that the cream always rises to the top. I'm always excited because the longer something goes, it gets dragged down a bit. And so I'm excited. And I thank you for joining us, Roman, and hope to have you on in the future.
Thank you very much for having me and for wonderful questions. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Have a great day.
And you too.
Bye.